Sorry, Sky, here comes another recording. Okay, good morning. It is April 23rd, 2021. This is a meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee. Thanks everyone for joining us on our new Zoom platform. We just spent a little time talking about the intricacies of Zoom, so apologies in advance if we screw anything up. Let's see, we posted our agenda and sent it out to folks, I think yesterday. So hopefully you've had a chance to review that. And our first task is to see if there's any suggested changes to the agenda and to approve the minutes. But now that I'm looking at the agenda, I don't know if the minutes were actually did go out, since there wasn't a hyperlink to them. So we'll take that up next time. So any changes to today's agenda or questions? Great. Okay. So just high level, as we've been doing, we've got a number of agenda items, and then we'll wrap up near the end of the meeting, looking ahead to our next agenda and any work assignments in the interim. And we will then have some time for members of the public. And when we get near to that point, we'll ask the folks who are here to identify themselves if they'd like to speak, and we'll make time for that to happen. So our first agenda item is just a brief report out from our task coordination leads. I think this is going to be kind of a standing item for us going forward. Those groups are just getting going, so there might not be much to report out, but if there is anything of note to share with the group, here's an opportunity to do it. I can go first. I'm the lead of the natural and forested land sequestration and storage task focus. We did have an initial meeting this week that some of the members were able to participate in, others were not able, which is fine. We know that there's a lot of demands on everyone's time. And I just circulated some notes to the group this morning on that, but really it was a kind of a framing meeting to look at our charge, to look at the language, relevant language in the act, and kind of tease out our, the focus areas for our work and the questions we have on how we prioritize and structure it going forward. We agreed that coming up with a shared document, like a Google Drive form to capture existing and proposed strategies in those spaces would be a good idea. And Allie put that together for us. And we'll meet again soon to discuss next steps. And I know we're going to spend some time with Pat today talking about bigger picture timeline and deliverables, which hopefully will inform the work of all the task groups. So that's our update. I don't know if let's see, the other leads are Ryan, Lauren, Abby, I believe. So I don't know if either of you want to share any brief updates.
Should we rock, paper, scissors for who wants to go first?
We'll go in alphabetical order. Abby.
I always lose on that one. Come on. So we were able to meet this week. We are in the very beginning stages, but we have confirmed that Megan Browning from NOFA is available to help us sort of structure out the work, help with some note taking and some development of our work plan and the way that we want to move forward. And we sort of decided broad level to sort of utilize the farm to plate strategic plan as a starting point to sort of help us build from there, but certainly bringing in lots of different factors along the way. So we are moving along, but don't have any massive updates to report at this time.
See, I think L comes before R, so Lauren.
I even raised my Zoom hand. Let's see, the nature-based solutions team, we met on Tuesday. It was our second meeting. John was able to join this time, so we kind of swapped out with Jake, who was unable to join. We ended up going for 2.5 hours, John, Judy, Allie, and myself. It was a really good conversation. we had some like foundational conversations that we wanted to kind of share with this group. So I've asked Billy and Abby if we could have some time on next week's agenda to share what our shared learning and conversation was. So we'll talk a bit about that next week as a small group. And started talking about the larger buckets of work that we would think we would talk about, different strategy developments to include things, nature-based solution buckets like rivers and floodplains and ag systems and those kinds of things. So no big things to report at present, but I think a really good conversation, and welcome Judy and or John to jump in and correct anything that I might have said incorrectly.
All right, thank you for that, Mr. Patch.
Thank you, Mr. Coster. Yes, we met yesterday, subtask group 5C. We are working on planning and believe we found a time for a standing meeting beginning the week after the 29th, which is good. We had begun discussions of the subtask group's work plan, trying to break out some of the questions that we would hope to answer over the course of our work to share with the subcommittee, and believe that the draft that will remain a draft, but a working draft, is in good shape. And I look to accept changes and share that draft with the subcommittee to make sure that folks are just aware of the direction that we think we're heading. And next week, perhaps we get some feedback from this subcommittee on what's included therein. The discussions, we're trying to start from both directions. I think big picture, right? Where do we see practices or programs having the most potential impact, cost-effective impact, what have you, on the charge of reducing, developing recommendations to reduce the gross and or annual net greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think that was a very fruitful discussion to understand the different perspectives that the respective members brought to that conversation. And then the Agency of Ag shared a presentation digging into the current framework that is the reduction targets for ag emissions on the 3 different timelines, to try to share a bit about how the emissions inventory is conducted and some potential gaps for consideration when developing and making recommendations for programming. And I will also convert that PowerPoint to a PDF and share that with the subcommittee and the subtask group for awareness as well.
Thanks, Ryan. So we'll probably going forward have more time at these meetings for the task groups to kind of report out generally and share information that Ryan's talking about. So thanks everyone for keeping that work going. And we'll talk. Oh, let's see, Lauren. Yes, you look so very far away.
I know. As we have these breakouts and sustaining, I wonder if we can ask Iris, who it doesn't look like she's here right now, but if she can kind of be part of that standing as an update from the conversations in Just Transition, so that it's kind of like each of the task groups and Just Transition report out.
Sure.
Okay.
She's well on. That sounds good to me. Okay. And I think we'll get into this more in a little bit with Pat, but I think I'm coming to realize that we're going to need to make some substantial progress on our kind of suite of strategies, likely by early June, late May. So these next kind of 4 or 5 weeks are going to be pretty critical ones for the task groups to get cranking. So hopefully Pat can lead us through that conversation in a more detailed way in a little bit. So the next thing we have on here, and just for you all to share, Jane, Abby, and I met with Pat earlier in this week to talk about today's meeting, to work on the agenda. So the agenda is kind of a collaboration amongst all of us, for your background. So the next item is a debrief on last week's meeting and the multi-factor assessment tool that we discussed. I think Abby, feel free to speak to it, but I think it was a great conversation. I think we saw the value, both the value in the tool and some of the, opportunities for improvement or kind of the limits of its applicability for our work. And I think thank you all to the people who were working to develop it and your willingness to kind of make some tweaks to align it with how we kind of collectively saw it most effective. So I don't know if there's anything further to discuss there. I think there was going to be some effort to make some revisions based on our conversation, and I'm not sure where that stands. So I don't know, Abby, if you have anything to add, but I see Jane has her hands up.
I was just writing into the chat. I mostly wanted to comment just on something from the previous topic, if I could. I can also put it in the chat if that's helpful.
No, go for it.
Okay. I just wanted to suggest that this came up at Just Transitions last night and has come up in many different ways. But with respect to your comment around strategy development and timeline, I just want to sort of put a pin in. There's a lot of conversation happening around public engagement and the timeline around public engagement and what that means for how fast we can proceed with the development of strategies, recognizing that we're sort of coalescing around like 3 periods of public engagement, like the first being initial engagement and outreach around the work of the council broadly and getting input from the public to inform strategy development. And so I just suspect that after the Climate Council meeting on Monday, we may be thinking about a different timeline around putting forward strategies for the public to consider that is further out than June. Not 100% on that yet, but if we really want to hear from the public and have the public comment and inform our strategy development, I suspect when the consultants present on Monday and they share with us what they need for a timeline around getting that input, that we're going to sort of have to proceed at a more cautious pace. So great to move forward, but of course we want to engage the public in this part too. So just also want to be cautious about going too far down the road. So thanks.
Thanks, Jane.
I think just to, I'll just add about the MCA more specifically, just so that everybody's kind of on the same page. I think that basically our takeaway was that it's a really, really valuable tool and one that we want to definitively utilize. We just want to make sure that it that there isn't any misconception about the fact that it is a tool, not a decision-making mechanism, because we have to reach consensus within the subcommittee. And so this is just a tool that we're utilizing to filter information to sort of put into these strategies or suggestion to then bring to the full subcommittee so that we can reach consensus on anything that we've come up with, but so that we all have sort of a unifying mechanism to try to filter the strategies that we do decide to bring forward. Feel free to correct me if that is incorrect as to what we determined, but I think that was sort of the takeaway.
I also just wanted to suggest that, last night at Just Transitions, every time someone spoke, you had to keep track of how many times you were speaking. And it's now makes me really, really conscious of how much I talk. So I'm sorry if somebody else is going to jump in. But I did just want to also suggest that Iris, in her role liaisoning between your committee and Just Transitions, brought up the multi-criteria assessment tool with Just Transitions last night, and sort of the work that you're doing to try to include equity principles and more. And you spoke to this too last night. Last night, Just Transitions spent the majority of their meeting sort of diving into drafting principles, and they were facilitated by a postdoc, Indra from UVM, the Rubenstein School Bindu student. And he really led an amazing facilitated conversation around values and principles that will help inform your tool, I think, also, in the work of all the subcommittees. And I think Iris was sort of proposing that this felt like a chicken and egg thing around including equity over here in a tool when they're also, thinking about principles and equity assessment. and wanting to have a conversation, recognizing that it was great that this subcommittee was thinking about equity and how to include it in a ranking tool, but also recognize that their significant role in helping think about those components for you all, or with you all, I should say. So I think there'll be some back and forth on that with them too, needed.
Thank you. Okay. Any further thoughts on these topics before we move on?
Billy, this is Pat. I just wondered if Lauren or David would want to speak kind of next steps with the tool, what the thought is in terms of kind of advancing it so it's, you know, ready to use, quote unquote.
I'll let David jump in since I missed most of the conversation last week.
I was just going to say, I'm going to let Lauren take the lead. It was her brilliant idea in the first place. Well, I think that's, I don't know the answer. I think that's a question, Pat, that the group needs to answer for itself. We didn't really get to a conclusion exactly. I think in concept, as has already been described, the idea is, yeah, it's Alyssa's brilliant idea. But the goal was to create a tool that would help us filter ideas so that we were focused our time and energy on the areas where A, we either needed more information, or B, we were really excited about it and wanted to further develop it, or C, we had there was a disparity of opinion that we wanted to spend time resolving, and then not spend our time on things that we either were sufficiently well developed, we agree upon, and we want to move forward with, and we just put them up on the board and leave them there, or things that we just don't want to spend time on because everyone agrees they're not worth spending time on. So the idea is to have it as a filtering tool, not a decision-making tool. And we had some discussion last week about not wanting to have it be too overly numeric, we didn't want to have it, an early version had a fairly, it wasn't that complicated, but for those of us who don't like numbers, it was, you know, had a sufficient number of numbers with it. It kind of created a sense that a fear that we might use the numbers themselves to define our decisions and might get too wrapped around the axle about figuring out whether this should be weighted at a 5 or a 3 or whatever. So I think, I'm hoping I've captured our discussion as a group, but I think we still have some work to do to decide exactly how we're going to get it to a final form, and then where in the process we'll start using it to lead discussion.
So it sounds like it's a work in progress. The Just Transitions may have some input from their values discussion that will help further inform it as well.
And Judy just put in the chat that she felt like it was a great discussion maker, and I totally agree. I thought it prompted just amazing, really rich conversation that's going to be necessary as we move forward. I mean, I personally see that as a lot of the work are those conversations where we see the gaps and can have the questions asked by those, you know, by everybody who's coming from a different perspective and things like that. So Judy, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that, but.
I'm good, thanks.
Alyssa, you have your hand up. You're muted.
Thank you. I apologize. I just wanted to suggest for next steps on this that it felt like our conversation about it at our last meeting was cut off due to time, and we didn't really get to kind of the end of the practice and thinking about consensus on next steps. And so maybe we should put in some time during our next meeting to talk about how many times we'll revise it and what the timeline for having a completed tool should be. And maybe David and Lauren and I can email in the meantime about refining it based on any other feedback we get. So I would encourage everyone to email us more feedback on refining the tool. We'll look for input from Just Transitions, and then it would be great if we could make more time during one of our standing meetings in the agenda to discuss it.
Sounds good. Okay, that sounds like a good next step for the tool development. Thanks everyone for that. Let's move on to we've got some time here for an update from Just Transitions from Iris, if she has joined us. I don't think she has. Let's see, are we on schedule 10:30? We're a little early. So Lauren, were you the one who had asked for this?
Or what?
Having Iris join us today?
Oh, I think
She's a liaison.
Okay. I just don't know if she's aware that she's on our agenda or not.
I did ask her
No.
beforehand if she felt comfortable giving an update, and she said yes. So, but I know she's a student. Maybe she's in the class right now, or
Gotcha.
something else will
Okay,
come
well,
up.
let's move on to our next topic, and then if and when Iris joins, we can either pause or see if she can kind of plug in a little bit later. That sounds okay with everybody. All right, great. So next topic is starting to look a little bit more deeply at our work and the kind of objectives we're trying to accomplish through our different task groups, and really what we need to deliver for the Climate Council report, so that the task groups have a little bit more clarity and focus. And this was a conversation that Pat has offered to lead for us. So I'll pass it on to you, Pat.
Okay, great. Thank you. Nice to see everybody. So what we thought we'd try, but we want to try this out. I'm going to share my screen. Is you have your kind of task 5A, 5B. You've got this kind of broad sort of task. And what we thought we'd do is kind of try to brainstorm the subtasks that go underneath. We're not talking like 100 things for each, right? But like the 4 or 5 key things that kind of need to get done under that. And ultimately, this will be kind of translated into a work plan. What the community resilient group did was kind of take this and just keep iterating it until they had tasks, subtasks, who were kind of the leads, which we already know from your groups, right? Kind of what are roughly deadlines for these subtasks. And 2 things I think to think about that we can play with is, one, where there are certain subtasks that maybe have a real strong stakeholder engagement component where you really need to engage people or some set of people outside of this group. And the other thing I think is to continue to think about how equity infuses these subtasks as well, whether there's an equity subtask in each or cross-cutting or both. I think just as we go through this, people just think about that. So again, equity is not a secondary filter, but it's core and central to the work that we do.
Pat, could I just interrupt for a quick second? I see that Iris has joined us, so it may make sense just to go back and hear an update for her before we get too deep into this, if you're okay.
Yep, agreed.
Hi, Iris, welcome.
I am so sorry.
No, we were ahead of schedule, so you're still early, so no need to apologize. Thanks for joining us, and we were just wondering if you'd be willing to give us, a real brief update on the Just Transition Subcommittee as our liaison with that group.
Yeah, of course. So at our meeting yesterday, we worked a lot on the guiding principles. So hopefully we'll have those for you all by the end of the month. We did just a Jamboard with some thoughts that actually might be kind of beneficial for the subcommittee to look at. I'm not sure if that's the intention, but there's just some good guiding principles there to go into the guiding principles, I guess. And we are looking to get those to you as soon as possible, and then doing some more work before the Climate Council meeting on the public engagement and working with the consultants. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Iris? Well, we appreciate you joining us and all the work of that subcommittee. We know how critical it's going to be for all of our work to be successful. So if there's anything you ever need from this group, please just let us know. Okay, great. And Iris, if it's okay with you, we were planning on including you in our kind of weekly report outs from our different task groups within this subcommittee, and having you as our liaison give a brief update each week from Just Transitions, if that works for you.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks.
Super, thank you. Okay, any other questions or comments related to Iris's report? Okay, seeing none. Pat, back to you.
Great. And Billy, if I could just one question for Jane. Will this group have a chance to meet the consultants at some point and kind of them explain in more detail their role and the like for helping with equity and stakeholder engagement?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not sure what that looks like 100% yet, but yes, we have talked about the need for a consideration on how the consultants, both Climate Access and RISE, work not only with Just Transitions, but also with the other subcommittees to have impact, to get input around the stakeholder engagement early on, and then the iterative nature of receiving and reviewing public engagement. And that will be sort of some of the focused conversation about the public engagement and how the consultants work with the subcommittees on Monday at the Climate Council meeting.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. I hope I find the right one here. Okay, here we go. So can people see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me just adjust my screen so I can see all of you in my double screen here. All right, so this will be a little bit annoying because it blocks your view of each other. But what we thought we would do is start with each of the the task leads, and if you can say like, here's what I think our 4 or 5 kind of core tasks are underneath our mandate, right? Or 5A, 5B, whatever. Start there, and then the full group here weigh in on here's other things I think you should be doing. Here's things to think about. I'm just going to take notes as you go. Want people kind of to jump in if they're willing, but I thought we'd start with kind of the task leads for this group, describe what you think are the key, sort of subtasks, and then we'll have some discussion among the group. And we don't, let's see, we have, how are we gonna do this? We have about 35 minutes on this. So since we've got 5, we'll want to spend about no more than 6 to 7. So maybe Billy or Abby, you can keep me on track and tell me when we need to move on to the next one, just because we're out of time. Okay, Ryan.
Sorry, everything's muted. Not trying to jump the line. I know that there are many other representatives from the subtask group that from 5C that would be able to share. My question, I unfortunately have a legislative hearing I have to leave for in 12 minutes. But if folks are open to it, we could share and have a discussion on the 5C work plan first. But I don't want to jump the line if it's important to move through it stepwise.
Co-chairs, what do you think?
On with me.
Okay. All right, let's do it. So 5C is the identify and develop initiatives, program strategies, reduce gross and net annual greenhouse gas emissions from ag, land, and ag operations. So that task group, do you want to describe what you are thinking as some of your key tasks? And I'll start typing and we'll discuss.
Sure, I will share what's on a document that the other members should have as well. The thoughts that went into developing about 9 steps include 1, defining terms that are commonly used within task 5 and task 5C, gross and net greenhouse gas emissions, ag land, ag operations, carbon sequestration and storage, maladaptive practices. You may not have to write them all down, but just a generic perception that, right, it's good to make sure we're all speaking about the same things, so we're not talking cross purposes. The second point was a review of the existing agricultural emissions inventory prepared by DEC to understand how ag emissions are quantified and how emission reduction or mitigation strategies could be embedded within the emissions inventory, and if gaps exist with the current methods or protocols. We learned, as was shared in the full Climate Council, the 4 main sources of ag emissions, and one specific discussion point the group raised was to review that emissions protocol and methods to identify and discuss any potential gaps. The second component to that, or next step is, the gross emissions, right? That's what the current DEC ag emissions inventory quantifies. And if we're moving towards a net greenhouse gas emission strategy, there may need to be another ledger or sequestration side to be able to quantify a potential net emission. And for that, reviewing, I think Task 5A very well informs that potentially with the soil carbon inventory or carbon budget, for which the land use and land use change in forestry, carbon sequestration section of the state inventory tool that DEC utilizes could be a process to get to that net question around emissions and emissions reduction. The next step is a discussion around review existing programs in Vermont. Are there programs that are currently developed that either directly or as a co-benefit can provide outputs for greenhouse gas emission reduction, mitigation, and then of course all of the co-benefits for adaptation and resilience, and looking to build a matrix to quantify the programs and inventory of the programs, and then also attempting to potentially put a directional question on whether it has benefits, it has impacts on those other co-benefits. Also reviewing what's work that's been done ahead of us, both existing plans within the state of Vermont, Climate Action Council, whatever the group was before the Climate Council, but existing plans and strategies from Vermont and regional states. Thought it'd be important to consider to make sure we're not reinventing the wheel. If there's a good framework out there, we could borrow it and hopefully adapt it to Vermont. And then the next is identifying, which is part of the first section of Task 5C beyond what's bolded there, identify and develop initiatives, programs, and strategies that could reduce gross and net annual greenhouse gas emissions. So, looking at some of the practices, programs, or performance outcomes that the subtask group could identify as having an impact on those emissions or other net reductions, looking at current rate of adoption, gaps and strategies, or trying to understand if there are practice programs we are doing, those that we should be doing, or some that aren't appropriate, perhaps within the existing plans and strategies that were identified before. Further, this is just plugged in at number 7, but it is something that could be inserted sooner in the process, and this is kind of a process question. Identify gaps in knowledge that could require contractor support. As it relates to developing a net emissions inventory, that's obviously an area where there could be a need for that additional support, as well as potential emission reduction coefficient development and other evaluation of potential impacts from practices or programs that directionally we think, sure, this could definitely have an impact. What would those potential emission reduction benefits be, or other benefits for carbon sequestration and other co-benefits? Cost of implementation is another step, as well as the current scale of adoption. And then the reviewing the practices and strategies that have been kind of aggregated and discussed for prioritization informed by cost effectiveness, technological feasibility, and equitability considerations. And maybe some notes from the subtask group being aggregated and shared with the full subcommittee for consideration and being put through the matrix for evaluation. But trying to do some of that preliminary discussions within the group, I think could be beneficial. And I would stop hogging all of the airspace now and ask others on the subtask group to tell me what I missed and what's potentially wrong there. So, and what I've represented. So, thank you.
So, additional, thought, any questions about these, or steps you think are missing, or clarification people want?
So, Judy has a question in the chat around where is TEK or the other equity components.
Judy, I'm going to be very honest and say I'm not sure that any of us on this group are knowledgeable enough to know how or in what way TEK would be or should be worked into how we're formulating this. And so I don't know if we want to have you maybe join one of our task group meetings to talk about that, or what the right way is to address that. What I was going to ask was one way that maybe that comes up, or I had thought that potentially that comes up, is we had talked about the fact that particularly in the conservation easement framework, farmsteads tend to be stewarding both what's considered farmland, but also a lot of other natural systems. And potentially TEK is something that we would need to be worked into how that is thought about, the way that the very technical way that they measure a lot of the ag emissions and things like that don't take into consideration the entire ecosystem of a farm. So they're just measuring the emissions or the land from the actual emissions from the processes involved, from tractors, buildings, things like that, or the way that the cropland functions versus the full ecosystem function of farms that have forest land as well as wetlands, as well as, you know, the entirety of the ecosystem function. I don't have any great answers to that, but it's a great question.
I wonder, Judy, if there's a two-step here. One is, I think, to actually specifically think about TEK in this task specifically, as well as then to screen for equity and other things as you evaluate the various programs. But I think there's, as you said, Abby, there's a whole traditional ecological knowledge from either indigenous peoples, people working the land, whatever, that just may be completely not captured in the programs. And we probably need to have some time thinking about that to figure out how to get at it. Judy, I don't know what your thoughts are.
I think it's important to include them. I'm thinking of all the people who harvest bark for material culture, or harvest mushrooms or fiddleheads, and all of that component. There seems to be programs starting up to replenish areas that typically have fiddleheads and leeks or ramps, because they've been over harvested in riparian zones, and people don't understand the proper way of harvesting. And so they're killing them off and consequently destroying the diversity in riparian zones and forests. And I think those are such important parts to places to retain carbon storage. And so I think that should be considered.
I don't know if I've added in quite right, but I've added in as a specific task for the group to wrestle with. Other questions about this piece here? Just because of time, we're ready to move on, but any other final considerations here? Okay, anything else? Others will move back to the top. All right. So develop a current carbon budget, and maybe the task leads there could describe what you're thinking as kind of your key steps you need to do. And Ryan reviewed a few things that might circle back to this as well from the other. But
yeah, thanks, Pat. This is Billy, and I don't know that we're going to spend a ton of time on this one, because I think largely we're waiting on the contractor, the technical support contractor, to come on board, who's going to be charged with developing the budget. And I think this group is going to advise that work, help establish methodologies, things of that nature, but and kind of check in with the other task leads to see what sort of analysis they might need and rely on coming out of the carbon budget. But beyond that, I don't know that we've got a ton of detailed to-dos at this point. But Ryan, Jane, others, Alyssa, we actually haven't met as a group, so if others have thoughts, please feel free to weigh in.
Other thoughts?
Well, I guess I'll just comment from a like preparation standpoint and methodology standpoint, and Allie should speak up, but there is a back conversation around that's being driven by questions from consultants for the RFP and on what we really want to do with the carbon budget, sort of carbon budget versus carbon inventory is the sort of tension I'm getting between, not a tension, but just the difference between some approach we can take here. So I think there'll be there should be some rich conversation within a smaller group to really think about what we want to do here and then how it will ultimately inform our tracking, the tracking and monitoring framework for the climate action plan itself. So I agree with you, Billy, that it's really about engaging with the contractor, but I think there'll be some upfront work to ensure that we're coordinated on what we all view the carbon budget to do.
Sounds good.
Other thoughts on this one? So maybe it will get flushed out as you get the contractor on board. I've got kind of at least 3 tasks there I think you've named. Okay. And again, Ryan referred to this in, Judy asked a question about will the carbon budget include traditional ecological knowledge? I don't know if people can answer that or not, but I can put it in here.
I think it certainly can. It'd be good for Judy, and maybe I can share this with you offline, how we frame, for you to look at, if you haven't, how we framed it in the RFP with the sources and fluxes, and see if you feel like that captures what you're thinking too. And I can share that with you in the email.
All right. Anything else on that before I move to 5B? Okay, the next one is identify and develop initiatives, programs, and strategies that reduce gross and net annual greenhouse gas emissions from Vermont's natural lands. And I think
So this is, it's actually natural and working lands, we've kind of teased this one out to be natural and forested lands. So it's working forests, natural forests, wetlands, things of that nature, just to clarify. And I can start off, we've had one meeting of this group. Not all of the members were able to participate. So, nothing I'm going to say is set in stone, and others should certainly feel free to weigh in. But the initial conversation we had was not too dissimilar to what Ryan summarized for 5C. I think that the goals are similar. Our main focus is maximizing carbon storage and sequestration through our natural and forested lands. So, upfront, we're going to have some engagement around the carbon budget development to make sure that that is capturing and presenting, the data that we need to analyze our recommendations and track progress over time. We need to explore existing program strategies and ideas related to maintaining and increasing sequestration in these land types, maintaining and increasing storage, look to see what's working, what isn't, where there's the best co-benefits associated with those existing or known strategies, and then to develop new or look at emerging ideas and strategies that could make progress on both the sequestration and storage front, and again has significant co-benefits and are filtered through our equity lens. We then want to make sure that none of our suggestions support maladaptive practices, and then we want to look at those sorts of activities that exist currently on the landscape, like land converting forested or natural landscapes to other land uses that emit or don't store as much carbon, and see if there are strategies to prevent, limit, or mitigate those impacts. And then lastly, and I think a piece that we're going to need some guidance from the cross-sector mitigation group on, is looking at gross emissions associated with forest land management. There's a clear charge around the ag sector to look at actual emissions, not just storage and sequestration. That's not as explicit in the Act for forest land management, nor are the emissions associated with that sector as significant. But if that is something that we get some direction from cross sector around, we can certainly run with it. So I think that's as kind of far as we got. And I know that, Charlie was at that first meeting, so please feel free to speak up. And David and Judy are other members of the group. So if you have thoughts, please speak up.
I think you captured the broad strokes of it, Billy, well. I mean, the only thing that we discussed that isn't listed here is just trying to tie these programs to any existing resources that might exist, just so that we have supporting documentation. But I think we're still pretty early in sorting this out. And we definitely want to get David and Judy's feedback as well, because they weren't able to attend that first one. So it's still developing a lot, I think.
Yeah, and this would be a very good place to develop an initiative to recognize and educate foragers that have businesses. Because I know myself, I get permission from the Natural Forest, U.S. Natural Forests to get permission to harvest. And I know that there are many, many others that are harvesting on a regular basis from the forest and the natural lands. And there's this direct connection with the National Forests and the Vermont Land Trusts. And I just think there should be some kind of thumb on that and how that process is working and whether it could be considered a part of this as well.
That's great. Sounds good to me.
This is in some ways more of a question than a comment. I'm wondering, because I realize there's a lot embedded in the idea of exploring new programs and possibilities, but I'm wondering if the idea I'm about to suggest fits within that, or if it's its own separate kind of task. But there's this kind of central issue that I think exists around forests that I find people start heading down two different tracks on this conversation and argue on two different lines that are not connected because they didn't take the time to actually make sure they were debating the right issue. And specifically what I'm thinking about is there's a lot of debate around forests around, well, is the way to sequester and store the most carbon through just letting the forest grow and having, removing human interaction from that. And then there leads to a whole set of conversations about the carbon budgets of forests, and that leads then to a set of policies that are largely around, should we just set aside a bunch of forests for wilderness? And that's a fascinating, interesting debate. And it kind of puts up questions like, should we, is it better to harvest trees for burning wood or for making electricity, and all fascinating, important discussions. But it misses, I go further upstream and ask a larger question, which is how do we keep our forests as forests in the first place? And if you ask that question, that's a prerequisite to figuring out what the debate is that we're having. Because if the choice is between having the forest as a forest or the forest as a subdivision, then all the issues about, is it better to manage the forest in a wild state or to harvest it, for forest products, is irrelevant. And so I'm just curious if that's something that's embedded in this task list, or if it should be kind of called out as a higher level, first level tier of conversation.
David, I don't know if I put on there, when we look at land conversion of any number of things, it could be land conversion, of forest. So I don't know whether if it's there saying, how do we keep forest in forest, or whether it belongs under programs and possibilities, as you said. I'm not sure.
Thanks, David. I do think those are the sorts of kind of threshold things we'll need to focus on pretty immediately. And a question that did come up when we met earlier in the week was like, how granular and specific do we need to get, or should we get, with our recommendations at this point in time for this first report? And, they could range anywhere from, keep a recommendation being keep forests and forests to very specific programs to incentivize certain sorts of management practices. And, I think we need to kind of figure out where on that spectrum we're going to fall. And these are the sorts of questions that will inform that. I think from my perspective, we should start with the broad goals and then get as far down in specificity as we can with the time that allows and where we can reach consensus. But yeah, the questions you're asking are key ones. And I think that's why it's important to know what the existing kind of lines of thinking are, because people have different views on these topics, and it'll be helpful to understand what they are and for us to be able to do some sort of analysis of their pros, cons, and co-benefits.
Billy, that raises the point for maybe 5B, 5C, and maybe 5D. I'll have to look at is what we don't have in here is actually identify the goals for this. So I think maybe, you know, in addition to kind of going into the tactical stuff around the programs, what is gaps at, but maybe each of these needs to say, what are we trying to do? And maybe that needs to be a clear 10 step here.
Isn't that goal defined by the task? Sorry.
I don't know. Good question.
Yeah, I think we might need to maybe sharpen up the specific. I agree with Charlie. I think it is, but we may want to put a little bit more meat on each one of those kind of sub goals.
All right.
And then, you know, just Jane has added in the chat. I know our agency has done a fair amount of work, David and others, looking at kind of the relative impacts of different management strategies and things of that nature. So that's all good data and information that can inform our thinking. Okay.
Question for Judy.
Anything for else from our group?
Judy raised a question about could you consider non-timber forest projects in riparian zones separately from forest? So maybe I should just make sure we include that in there.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's add this in quickly. My both bad typing and slow computer at the moment. Great. Anything else for now? All right. Task 5D. Identify and develop initiatives, programs, and strategies to improve adaptation of Vermont's natural and working lands. Is there two? Who are the task leads for that?
I'm the task lead for that, Pat. And I'll just, it's like the J team, Judy, John, Jake, and myself, with Allie and Bob joining us as staff support. So I'll at first admit before I jump in for my group, but this larger subcommittee, that we haven't yet really discussed this work in these terms yet. So I'm going to try to do my best based on the conversations that we've had and ask others from that team to jump in where I'm either inaccurate or need some support. I think this is kind of sequential too, Pat, for your benefit as you type these, but anyway, similar to Ryan, we did a lot of talking at our first couple of meetings about agreeing on definitions and that being really important. So defining key terms, coming to consensus on what those are. A recognition, the second one, that a lot of nature-based solutions are qualitative in nature, not necessarily quantitative. So that we were having a long conversation about values assessment and not really goal development, but kind of like a larger vision or mission for what a successful nature-based solutions approach to our work would be. An inventory of existing state-based plans, programs, regulatory opportunities, as well as things that we don't typically think of. Well, to Judy's good point, so opportunities within traditional ecological knowledge and things that we don't typically consider very well in state-based planning efforts. Identifying gaps and opportunities in each of those for nature-based solutions. And then the next one would be developing strategies, which would be using that multi-criteria assessment so that we are incorporating TEK, equity, biodiversity, all of the different things that are in there to make sure that we're having those conversations as strategies are being developed. Making sure that we're flagging working cross task. So I'm in 2 task groups And there's already quite a bit of overlap, I think, in some of the work that would be done there. And I would assume that's the case for all of our tasks, not to mention just other subcommittees. So making sure that as we come up with different strategies, or as we identify areas for strategies, that we're working with across the tasks to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts, or that we're sharing our knowledge. Identifying partners and stakeholders for the work to be done ahead. And then flagging more broadly, I think, as we talk about the different iterations of the Climate Council, subcommittee, tasks, etc., that there needs to be an opportunity for public engagement, and how we might be able to do that at the task level, I think is going to be really important too, since that's where a lot of those deep, good conversations are happening. And that's what I could get from scanning our notes, team. Did I miss anything, or does anything need to be revised?
Thoughts from folks about other key tasks this group would be doing. And I think, just to let you know, when this gets transferred into a work plan format, which we'll talk about a little bit later, then you start identifying start and end dates, so you can think about the sequence of these things and when you need to have them completed, which in part is tied to the work of this group as a whole, which is in part tied to the Climate Council's piece as a whole. So Jane will have to help us, as we kind of think through those kind of milestones. But Jane promised us all that we don't have to create a Gantt chart for the subcommittee.
And Pat, can you just add to that second row, like a semicolon or something, a values assessment?
Yeah, good. You bet. You bet. Yeah, anything I need to fix or correct, just other than my spelling, which I'll fix later. Absolutely. All right, task 5E. Again, this is the mitigation adaptation efforts to improve a whole host of things, right? Healthy soils, access, local foods, water quality, so on and so forth. So Abby, is this your group, I think?
It is. So similarly, I apologize. My laptop screen is too small for me to pull up our notes, the notes that Lauren took from this. So I'm sort of pulling off of my memory. So I think our broad intention is to start from the question of, what does a resilient Vermont food system look like? And then within that, how are these other components called out? What does that look like in relation to water quality, healthy soils? And then to Judy's point that she's made along this whole way, in centering the land and the soils, how does that then provide for the people and therefore the economy? And so looking at everything from current use to Act 250, to educational components, to food sovereignty and food access, to culturally relevant foods and how they're distributed among the state, to food and forest infrastructure and where that's located geographically throughout the state and how that's funded. I think the thing that comes up for me a lot with this work is that we tend to think about food secondarily, and particularly within the lens of climate change. Outside of the lens of climate change, food is critical, but we tend to not frame it like that. And so the work of this group, I feel, is sort of assessing, 1 in 3 Vermonters are food insecure right now, and how do we structure this work to ensure that that is not happening moving forward, and the systems that will ensure that that is mitigated, with a lens where the health of the land and the health of the soils is the first component of that, because as we all know, without healthy soils, you do not feed people. And happy to have Lauren, Alyssa, Charlie, or Jake add in anything else. To my earlier point also, the Ag Strategic Plan it provides a really broad and yet cohesive starting point for that work. And so I think we're going to sort of see what is there and how we can build on those components.
Questions? Yep, David.
I have a question, Abby. This is, forgive me for getting like too meta level. Like my brother says, I go fifth dimension.
I like it. Bring it on.
Kind of question, but when I think about where we're going globally, for a variety of reasons, global economic reasons, as well as climate change, I worry about the structure of our food system, and that as disease, drought, floods, global conflicts affect the food chain supply, that communities across the world, in Vermont not accepted, will face risks of disruption. One of the ways that historically the North America post-European development managed that was there was a lot of people that were farming at a small scale. And in World War II, there was the Victory Gardens idea where people became more self-sufficient. And I've wondered if it fits into the work of this group. In the discussion yesterday with the Ag Task Group, some of the discussion started to steer towards, do we need to eliminate agriculture? Is agriculture a source of emissions such that we need to reduce agriculture? And I've been thinking about just the opposite. Is there an importance to thinking about how we grow and expand our investment in agriculture and increase, individual or small scale access to small scale farming? And I wonder if that fits within this group, or if that's something that's already captured in the list that you identified.
I'm not sure whether I specifically captured it, but it's certainly something that I think about a lot, particularly given just what I experienced as being in the very southern part of the state and sort of the removal of this food system down here from the food systems where there's more tie-in to the broader state and things like that. So yeah, I don't think that you have a resilient food system structure without having assessed that. You have to, as climate change takes hold, again, I know we're very high level and meta right now, but as climate change takes hold, at least as I see it, the only way you have the hope of establishing resilient and adaptive people and communities and making sure they're fed is to embed that knowledge and that access, and not even that, nurture the knowledge that already exists in a number of communities, and resource them appropriately so that they can provide for themselves in the face of climate change. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, we're seeing it right now already. We're in drought number 2 right now. I don't know how I'm going to feed my animals. So yes, absolutely. That will be factored into this work. Is how do we feed people where they are in Vermont? And how do we ensure that, to the best of our ability, Vermont has the capability to have a food system that's resilient to feed its people? Because as we all saw, even during COVID, food systems are very brittle with even just a small shake of the status quo. And so I think Vermont has a unique opportunity to do that, given the public, as I perceive it, engagement and excitement over food sovereignty and access and local food systems. And so I think we have a unique opportunity to sort of show how that can be done here, and that we might actually be able to pull it off. And yes, Lauren just flagged the forest sector is also part of this task conversation, which Charlie and I talked about. That was part of the infrastructure conversation too, that again, geographically, where the different aggregation points, distribution points, how the logistics components of how products and access points move across the state is absolutely critical to be examined, as much within the food sector as within the forest sector.
Sure.
Sorry. Yeah, just to add to what Abby said, and also to say, as a recovering philosophy major, what seems like abstract to some people seems really concrete to me. So I appreciate the question and conversation. Yeah, and I just to add to it, I'd say the Ag Strategic Plan that just recently came out in February very much is written from kind of addressing the issues that you're raising, David. That obviously we need to build out a different system that both works in kind of the realm of an era of climate change, but also addresses a lot of the historic issues that have come through an industrialized global food system. And so, yeah, and that's, I think a lot of our conversation was about, not only just looking at what's happening, sort of at the farm sort of enterprise level, but is really the supply chain. And that's where the infrastructure, distribution, logistics pieces come in. There's all sorts of issues of, good ideas sort of at the farm enterprise level don't work because there's a lack of, investment in the right types of infrastructure, or there's lack of distribution access to the marketplace that's needed, or consumer education. Consumers aren't really putting money to the values that they state that they have. So I think all of those components are definite. Like we are thinking about sort of all of those kind of interacting pieces and trying to take, I think trying to look at it sort of at that kind of supply chain level in both forest and farm, economy and land management. So that's, I think that is very much the vision of the Ag Strategic Plan is what is a food system like the one we know and love in Vermont kind of look like at sort of scale in the region, and what are the kind of the needed investments that need to happen to make that really functional and sustainable economically and environmentally and socially too.
And also that we're not unaware of the massive inequity in access to both food and land within Vermont, and the problematic nature of how those systems are handled as well. And so that's an enormous component to how we're hoping to develop this as well. Is land access, as we all know, is impossible, nearly impossible if you're from a BIPOC community. And we have stolen land and we have a history, so all of those things are going to be worked into how we're assessing kind of where we're at and how we move forward to feed all of Vermont's people in ways that they genuinely, that they feel nourished. And Judy, I noticed you came off mute. Did you want to say something?
I did. Abby and I have been talking about traditional agriculture, and I have sent her a package containing many heirloom seeds, and she is going to create a garden, a little one, indigenous garden, to test out these agricultural techniques and include seed saving techniques to help other indigenous people. We have over 5 acres within Gedakina where we farm for medicinal purposes and food purposes, and reclaiming traditional agricultural techniques. So Abby's going to try to explore that in a little plot of her garden. She should get the packet today or tomorrow. But it includes seeds from it includes seeds from the Four Sisters, and how that agricultural practice helps to promote healthy soil within the area where the plants are grown, and how these plants help each other. These 4 plants help each other as they grow.
Right. I added a bit in there about TEK. I think it's important in that last line too. We're about out of time for this piece. So any other final comments for now, right now on this? And I think that, we'll get this back to the co-chairs and all of you. I think the key is just to, for each of your task leads to kind of build these out. You'll modify them, revise them probably, of course, and then we'll start attaching milestones and those things to them. Any final questions on that? Okay, let me save that. Stop sharing. We'll actually see each other. Okay. Maybe co-chairs, back to you to kind of just frame up maybe the next topic that we're going to try and cover.
Sure. So I think what we're going to focus on now with Pat is looking at the draft climate action plan outline and trying to kind of align what the expected deliverables are in that plan with our work and the work of the task groups, and some tools that Pat is going to suggest to help organize that work. So really just trying to figure out, what do we actually have to do on what timeline and how do we get there?
Jane, would you be willing to maybe share the outline that's been developed to just let people kind of see that, see if there's any explanation you want to talk to it, and then a little bit about what the timing is right now, recognizing given stakeholder engagement may change, but maybe I start there and then I'll come back to kind of how that maps onto the work here. Thank you. Jane, you're on mute too. We know you're there. There you go.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to unmute while sharing screen.
No
Past my Zoom knowledge. Okay, so hopefully many of you have both through Billy's outreach with you all ahead of this meeting and then also in preparation for the Climate Council meeting have seen the outline now for the Climate Action Plan. This has been somewhat of an iterative process to date with the steering committee's involvement. First, a couple weeks ago, seeing an initial draft outline, and then myself working to incorporate their comments at that meeting. And then even further refinement after our meeting last week. So we're hoping to tee up a conversation first and foremost about the outline with the Climate Council on Monday, and then as Pat suggested, also thinking about how we meet the deadlines for the December 1st completion of the plan with respect to how much engagement and involvement we want to do with the public around the plan. So again, moving target a little bit around timeline, but one of the things that I thought was really important to highlight for both this committee as well as the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee is really around scope of your work for this first December 1st plan. And Billy sort of alluded to that as you were going through the exercise with Pat a little while ago around sort of the level of detail that you'll deliver for the December 1st plan. And I think that it's explicitly clear, as this will be the only climate action plan. I shouldn't say only because we're required to update it within 4 years from the date of the first plan, but it doesn't preclude us from doing updates or revisions sooner than 4 years. But likely this will be the only climate action plan before we reach the 2025 statutory requirement for greenhouse gas reduction. So we know that around strategies for mitigation that are included in this outline, the ones for immediate implementation are going to need to add up to meet that reduction for 2025. And we know that we're also going to have to be on an aggressive path to meeting the 2030 statutory requirements, knowing that the next plan won't be enough time to really ensure that we meet the 2030 requirements. So when we're thinking about strategies and recommendations around mitigation, we know what the end game is for this plan. I think I would argue, as I think many of you would, that it's a little more open-ended when it comes for how we want to address strategies for sequestration as well as resiliency. There are some tools and clear guidance within the statute around things that we need to include and recommend, but there's not sort of a level of how far you want to go in this first plan and what comes after this plan through implementation and further refinement. And so what I wanted to suggest around a conversation for all of you isn't just what you think about this draft, but also get you to start to think about what you see as sort of necessary requirements for this first plan and what you see as something that could come at a later date. And that's something that I suggest you grapple with as a group, but then that would inform the work planning that each of the task leads does with their separate committees, recognizing that there's some commonality on sort of specificity that you're all striving for with your work. And then I will just suggest that, and maybe this is probably helpful for me just to talk about briefly the same kind of conversation that we'll have on Monday. But, you know, this is intended to be a draft structure. And as we sort of move forward with implementing this structure, my hope is then to be able to take this and provide you further tools and templates for you to be building and thinking about your work plans up into, so that we're all working towards a common goal. But the way that we've framed this, and we've thought a lot about this, it seems so simple now that it's actually in here, but sort of the buckets around the requirements for 2025, 30, and 50 is both within the strategies for mitigation, the strategies for sequestration, and the resiliency. There's going to be a suite of strategies that come out of this work over the next 6 to 9 months that are ready to roll, that we know are going to be a component of the work going forward. And so they're immediate. We have to act on them as soon as possible. And so that gets at the way we broke it out for mitigation is sort of the main leads, sectors, I should say, where we're prioritizing work. And so for all of these, transportation, and then further down the line around energy, buildings, non-energy emissions, we'll be thinking about what's ready to go and then what requires additional development and what are the things that are needed in order to get those ready for the next plan for immediate implementation. And we're hoping that for each of those strategies, there'll be a bucket of recommendations. You know, for transportation, there may be, you know, as many as, I don't know, but 25 to 50 strategies. And then even further, another 10 recommendations within each of those strategies. So I imagine this getting pretty big, pretty fast, and thinking about the level of detail that we need to go to, especially around mitigation. It's not just the strategies and recommendations. We have to get at the how, like, how are we going to implement this? What are the rules, the regulations, the policies, and how are we going to fund it? That all has to be considered in this first plan with respect to how the statute was written. But just the same, I organized your work here. I don't know if this is right, so this is what I'll ask you. I put immediately the strategies, sort of the big bucket, in around your task leads and what you're doing. So perhaps these are like carbon budget is actually not its own separate thing. Perhaps it's under, you know, a forest and natural lands sequestration heading, and that gets subbed in under as one of the strategies is maintaining a carbon budget and doing it on an iterative basis, and what is needed to upkeep a carbon budget and what that informs us. So that's also sort of goals for you to be thinking about, is what are the headings under the strategies for sequestration. And then I'll also suggest that your work, based on Lauren's role in helping me think about this, resiliency and adaptation, which we're going to talk about with them this afternoon in their subcommittee, your nature-based solutions, as well as the economic and food systems resiliency work that Abby's leading, will fit really under the resiliency heading, but will be coming out of your work, your task leads in this subcommittee. So it's under resiliency and adaptation, but it's really coming from your subcommittee. So again, thinking about what is right. And then, of course, thinking here about how we framed it up for your strategies for immediate implementation and what you will require additional development and what you want to think about under each of those headings. So it would be great. I'll just suggest, I think that that both the sequestration and resiliency components of this outline need the most work right now still, recognizing that it's not as guided by the statute. And it would be great through this conversation if Pat or I, and maybe if Pat takes some notes right now while we're talking, if there's any clear action items next for how you want to think about refining this or contributing to this, in order for me to characterize, or with your support on Monday, characterize the next steps for finalizing the outline and how it pertains to your work when we were talking with the Climate Council, recognizing that this is what they're going to have in front of them. And this probably does not meet the complete needs of this subcommittee yet.
Well, Abby, you dive right in.
This is probably going to seem like a very minor thing, but it flagged something for me. Down where we have underneath economic and food systems and we have community resilience, in parentheses, we have municipal, as though community resilience and municipal resilience are the same. They are not. And I'm concerned that that is a dangerous trajectory upon which to proceed. That assumption.
I'll let you. So I'll explain that, because that's actually a good catch. The way that the Rural Resilience has organized their work, they have a task group around municipal resilience. That seems too narrow for me, and so I wanted to reframe it as community resilience, and that municipal resilience would be sort of a sub-strategy underneath that topic, but I didn't want to lose that for when I talked with their subcommittee this afternoon. And so that's more of a note for me than it is anything else, because I think of community resilience as much broader as well, but see their municipal work sort of sliding in under that. So, but I could be wrong, and I'm going to talk about that with them this afternoon. Okay. Thanks for catching that.
Judy.
I have a question. When you talked about critical transportation and buildings and such, that came up in our meetings because we were talking about dams and restoring waterways and stuff. So within our groups, are we also talking about buildings, a building of things, roads and dams and the impacts?
Yeah, I can certainly see that from a resilience component, definitely. I think there'll need to be some sort of back and forth with respect to coordination with cross-sector, especially around thinking about electricity from dams and that component of it. But yes, it certainly makes sense. And from here, I'm thinking only about the mitigation components where it's framed in here, not the resiliency work around buildings, transportation, and things like that. That would be fall within your group, as well as rural resilience and adaptation. And feel free to.
In the work we just did, I don't believe that was mentioned in any of the categories.
Correct. So I wonder, so Judy, you're referring to water in particular, right? So waterways, et cetera, as a means of transportation.
No, because I'm thinking of what happened in Burlington when they built the belt line through the middle of the intervale and totally changed and impacted the protected waterways there. So I'm thinking of roads and dams and things like that.
Let me on the land conversion one. When I won't do it in front of you all because I'll be too slow, but I'll add back in under land conversion, which includes like housing, roads, dams, any kind of built environment that might actually be a land conversion from something natural to something not. So I'll put that in there. It's great catch.
Thank you.
Lauren.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Judy for re-elevating that. Judy, you brought it up at the beginning when we were talking about our task and how to create the sentence or sentences for it. And I think we actually incorporated it into our task, but I guess I would look at Billy or Jane, who probably look at that more than the rest of us. I think that we incorporated something along the lines of "and human impediments to our ability to adapt our national working lands." So I do hope that's something that we're capturing, at least within the nature-based solutions team. Community resilience is in statute for ag and ecosystems, and particularly the way that we interact with and place our structures very near to our river and riparian systems is a problem. And I think a lot of the work that we'll be doing, Judy and our task group too, will talk about opportunities for there to be better relationships between the built environment and our natural lands.
I'll add that about human impediments. I'll actually add that, Lauren, back into the piece I did too, just so we catch it. Charlie.
Oh, great, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I just had a question on wondering how we're using the term mitigation in the outline, and wondering if we're going to end up having kind of conflicting uses the way it's outlined. I think about mitigation in terms of we can mitigate something by like reducing the amount of fossil fuel emissions. We're going to mitigate the impact of that on climate change. But then mitigation would also be designing forest roads better so that they absorb the impacts of heavy rain events. And so I think of mitigation as being maybe two different kinds of mitigation. And I'm wondering, given the way that this is split between, you know, mitigation up top and then down at the bottom, mitigation is kind of included in some of these sub ones. And so is there going to have to be a conversation about when we use mitigation, what are we talking about, so that we can connect them correctly and not be duplicative and have it make sense overall? Thanks.
Because we're mitigating carbon itself, I guess, one question, Jane, but Charles pointed out that word is used in lots of different ways, and Lauren just put a nice example in the chat. So
yeah, and adaptation and mitigation get tossed around and sometimes combined, but also they do need to be separated. And so we do need to be careful in terms of whether well, I mean, I guess we could actually have a discussion if do we want to combine them in certain uses and be clear about that, or do we want to keep them separate?
Great point. I totally agree.
I don't have an answer to that. I just wanted to flag it as being something to keep thinking on.
It's also probably back to definition of terms is going to be important. And Jane, just to that point, because many of our task groups said the first thing we need to do is make sure we're talking the same language, define terms. I don't know if the Vermont Climate Council feel like they're doing some of that as well.
Yes. We have not talked about defining terms at the Climate Council level, but that's an interesting consideration.
So anything else right now on the outline? I think we're going to talk now about timelines in a second, but
Pat, it may be that you can't see me just because.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't see you. Yeah, go for it.
Things are minimized. I wanted to get in with a point that goes to the outline, which is I think goes to some of the tension I know came up in a discussion not that long ago, the Climate Council over like where does land use fit in and who owns it. And it seems to me that our group in particular has a number of ideas that are going to have mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, that's going to hit on multiple places. And we could spend a tremendous amount of time figuring out what our lane is and how not to infringe on other people's lanes, or governance questions about who we check in with. And we don't have time for any of that. So I'm going to make an assertion and then let people tell me I'm wrong. But my thought is that we proceed until apprehended on some of these ideas that we know are feeding, the goals of our priorities of our task force, even if they also touch on and address. In fact, because they address other multiple benefits is one of the goals that we have. And I say it in the context of the outline, because I think one of the shortcomings of any type of exercise like this, where we try to break into groups and put work together and then feed it back to the policymakers, is that each of us, as we focus on our piece of the elephant, may miss cross-cutting themes. I think that'll be the work, of course, of the Climate Council once they get all the reports to do that synthesis and look for that. But I do think as the outline is built, each of the subgroups should be encouraged to think about those cross-cutting themes and have a bucket for that for us to put stuff into. And I think the one that jumps out at me as a possibility for our group would be, building on this recent discussion at the national level about a 30 by 30 land conservation goal, that there may be an interesting opportunity for us to think about and defining what we mean by conservation, not just setting it aside as wilderness, but, better managing existing lands of all sorts, including working lands, but setting some targets and goals for the state. That might be a really compelling idea that aligns really well with the goals of the climate, of the Global Warming Solutions Act and our goals around climate. And I would love to be able to have some discussion as a subcommittee about some of those larger themes and ideas, and then feed them up to the Climate Council for their consideration.
Thanks, David. Any questions or comments on David's last point? One is run till apprehended, I believe was the first point. And then the second point about this broader question of kind of land conservation, how it ties to some of these other activities or conservation.
I'll just say I really like this, and I really like it from the framework of like, there's been a lot of apprehension to stay in our own swim lanes and not lean in. But I like this like flip on its head approach of like, no, actually, we should really lean into cross-cutting ideas and larger themes, and that should be something that can then elevate, some strategies and recommendations higher than others because of that cross-cutting nature and larger themes. So it's a nice way to think about things. So thank you.
Right.
Well, I think it ties into Judy's point that she's been trying to make along the whole way, that as much as we try to silo things off, that's impossible. It doesn't work. It causes overt harm when you silo things and when you don't have the holistic overview. And so I am all in favor of running until apprehended, and will plan to do so.
I think it's your new theme. It's good. All right. So Jay, I think one thing that I heard you say that I don't think we're going to solve it, but I think we just want to note, there are, again, in our group, really mitigation to Alexander just put the definition, mitigation involves both, reducing carbon output, but also sequestering carbon, right? And a lot of our work includes both those things. And then there's no resilience adaptation piece. So it sounds like the resilience adaptation piece may not have to go as far as detailed by the deadline as the mitigation, including both those things I said. Is that correct, that maybe the resilience adaptation doesn't necessarily have to go as deep or far as specific by December? I just want to be clear about what the Climate Council is saying.
Well, I think they're looking to have a discussion is the way I would pitch it, around how deep we're going to go with sequestration and resiliency by December 1st and what feels possible.
Okay. So maybe that's a good lead in. Do you mind unsharing your screen? I'm going to share a work plan format, which actually gets at potentially some of this timeline question. So bear with me a second. We'll pull this up. Okay. So this is not something you have to use. I think each subcommittee can do its own thing. This is just trying to take the work you just did and show you a format that the resilience group is doing to show, and then Alexander, then I'll come back to you. For Alexander raised your hand too. Essentially you'd have your objective, which is like 5A, 5B, 5D in there. You'd have your individual strategies, which you named, we started to name in that chart today. You have your lead members, your support members, other people maybe participating. What kind of outside support, if any, you need. If this thing is a task that has particular engagement that might be needed, and you could have other columns that you're checking on, and then you have a start and end date for trying to get that part of the work done. So the idea here is to take the kind of work generally and actually turn it into a bit of a schedule, essentially. And so if this format or a different one looks good to you all, then with the co-chairs' help, we can begin to take the work of the task groups and kind of put it into an overall work plan like this. It gets a little bulky, but at least gives you all a roadmap of what you're trying to do by when. And it frankly gives the rest of the council a format for what you're trying to do. And for the public, it's also just a way to convey, here's what we're doing. So I'm curious if I can take this down now, but I think that if something like this would be helpful, you all would prefer a different format for trying to hammer out a more detailed work plan. Or no strong opinions. It's also okay on this one. Okay, David, I see a thumbs up. That may be all we need. Anybody thumbs down? Judy, say more.
It's not really a thumbs down. It's more of a sideways thumb. I'm not a big fan of time and schedules because there are times when we need discussions. There are times when we need to listen to what people have to say and let that discussion take us where we go. Like our committee meeting last time ended up being 2.5 hours or so, because everybody agreed they had the time to continue discussing it. And we finally came to solutions when we did that. And so I just think there needs to be a little flexibility in there, because I understand there's time schedules, and we have no word for time in our language. When everything's ready and everybody's together, it's time. And we've kind of been taking that approach, and it's been working fine.
So I wonder, you make a really excellent point. So one is, I think within meetings, sometimes even agendas have times, right? And maybe we need to provide that flexibility you said, which can be really important. So it's worth the co-chairs thinking about how to schedule some flex for things like that might emerge that are really important not to lose in the moment. And I do think this looks very linear, and the way of thinking and iterating and developing is not linear, right? It often circles back on itself. There's eddies and diversions, and the main current may change course. So this has many imperfections. So I think if people can continue to think about that, which is an excellent point, how we address that within the, obviously there is a legislative schedule on that, but there's also the organic nature of building agreement and deeper understanding, which doesn't necessarily flow to legislative calendars.
I've been talking to several legislators about time, and they told me that that's the #1 complaint they get, and that if there's a problem with time, someone should talk to them about asking for more time.
Note to Jane. Okay. All right. Okay, so maybe with no further comment, I think I will turn this back to the co-chairs for anything else you all need to do, public comment, and I'll make sure that kind of the draft document we built here, I will get back to the co-chairs here cleaned up by tonight or first thing Saturday morning.
Great. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you.
So before we move on to public comment, just a placeholder for planning for next week's meeting. I know that let me find my notes here. Lauren had requested some time to talk about the natural solutions, kind of foundational pieces that you all discussed. We're going to do some follow-up on the multi-factor tool. I don't know if we'll want to reflect on the different tools that the outline and tools that Pat presented today. So just thoughts from others on how we want to spend our time next week. We'll certainly have report outs from the task groups. There'll likely be a report out from the next climate council meeting, which is on Monday. So any topics beyond that? I know Ryan also mentioned he wanted to get into some of the technical pieces related to soil carbon, but I don't know that next week is the best time for that. Abby, any thoughts on where we want to go next week?
Let's see. I'm sorry, I got distracted by something. I think we want to definitely make room for you probably already, I'm sorry, Billy. I just
cool.
totally
I said let's see, the Lauren's group wanted to kind of talk about the foundational work that they've done, yes, that they thought we'd all benefit from, and maybe regroup on the multi-factor tool. And I can't tell if David has his hand up or if he's just playing with his ear. He does. So David, what's your thoughts?
I was resting my hand. It was so exhausting to leave my hand up. I just had this, I had this conversation with Ryan in the Ag Task Group of like, I have just the way my brain works. I want to talk about the stuff. I want to get to the ideas. And there's a part of me that's going totally freaking nuts with not being able to talk about ideas yet, that we just keep staying at this kind of meta level of process, which I totally appreciate. We have to go slow to go fast. But if we could carve out any time, to the extent that any of the task groups have some breakthrough, like some brilliant idea or some cool thought about a way to approach this, that's a substantive recommendation. Like we're super excited about dairy cow feed. I don't know. I just picking on something that came up yesterday. Like, you know, seaweed and feeding seaweed to dairy cows. It's the answer. Like, I would love to just have a little bit of time for people to throw out really cool ideas that are popping into their brains. And we don't have to spend time taking deep dives into it, but it would just feed a little bit of my soul of wanting to like get a little more concrete at this group level, knowing we're supposed to really do that work at the task group. But I keep wondering if there aren't some ideas that are percolating among the people on this call right now that we could just kind of inject some energy into all of us by getting a little more concrete.
Absolutely. I think we can have just some unstructured time for kind of big idea sharing and kind of group brainstorming across the task. So I that sounds great to me if others are agreeable.
That sounds great. You know, I'm gonna do something I haven't done yet. I'm gonna tell you why I just lost my train of thought and what I am distracted over. And it is the fact that I said, I'm all in for running until apprehended. And I am aware that in the context of the national events of this week, that was an extraordinarily white privileged thing to say. And I'm really distracted by the fact that I didn't catch that until it came out of my mouth. And I just want to call that out because I wasn't going to, because I'm not sure if it's the time or the place, but at some point these things have to be talked about in these forums as well, I think. And I just want to acknowledge that was potentially a really harmful thing that I said, and I'm sorry. And I apologize that I couldn't catch it as it fell out of my mouth. And I'm aware of the fact that that's happening likely more often than I'm even realizing, and is some of the components of this work that I think are the work and are the pieces that are so difficult, and that we do need to try to open ourselves up to talking about those things as they happen, because I don't want further harm to happen. So that is why I lost my train of thought. I apologize, but I just want to say that that is why, and I will try to continue. I am trying to continue learning and doing better as I'm moving through this, and these online formats I'm finding very difficult to do that in, but wanting to put that out there. I'll leave it there.
Thanks for that, Abby. I think we're all learning, and we're all, I think, hopefully gonna be supportive of each other. So I'm sure we'll all have our own little trip up. So thanks for naming that and sharing it for us. All right. Exactly. Thanks for leading with sharing those thoughts, Abby. Lauren.
Yeah, I noticed yesterday I tend to adjust transitions for the first time in real life. I tried to capture some of them in YouTube retrospectively, and noticed that they have 2-hour meetings as well, and they have a public comment period in the middle as well as at the end, and wondering if that seemed like there was a woman who came who was able to speak both times about different parts of the agenda, and if we have only 5 minutes at the end of 2 hours, we're kind of requiring a lot of these great public members I see on here now to wait. And I'd love to see that us replicate that work that they're doing and provide 2 public comments in our 2-hour meeting as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was something Pat had suggested for this meeting, but it was just a little late in the game for Abby and I to kind of pull that together as part of the agenda. So I think, we can certainly think about that more for next time and likely work again. Charlie.
Thanks. This may be like totally jumping the gun and getting way too far ahead of ourselves, and it's more of a question for the full council, but is there any discussion or like flagging for a discussion of what the rollout of this is going to look like, and how that's going to be done in terms of essentially managing public relations around it? I've just found that a lot of this stuff, there's so much stuff happening in the space, and there's so much information out there that's either good, bad, or somewhere in the middle. And it can really impact the ability for a product like this to actually affect change unless there's like a deliberate plan for that. and that involves this group and partners. And I realize that's kind of like way up here and way at the end, and we have a lot of work to do. But if we don't think about that up front, we could get tripped up on the back end of that. So I'm just curious what the discussion around that's been. Thanks.
Is Jane still with us? Yeah, Jane, feel free to respond to that.
Thanks. Yes, we're starting to think about that, and that'll actually be part of the conversation as we talk about engagement and outreach on Monday, because that was certainly included in the proposal from the consultants who will now be working with us on that. So yes, we're starting to think about that, as well as starting, in the governor's proposal for ARPA funding. There is $100 million proposed for climate action plan implementation. So the idea is that, and Julie, Secretary Moore, I should say, will speak to that on Monday alongside with other secretaries and commissioners around that money and how that money is intended to sort of be held back in order to wait to see what comes out of the climate action plan as high priorities, so that the Climate Council can advise on how that money is directed at sort of the most ready to go, highest priority programs and initiatives and recommendations. And so certainly rollout will be really important, and that starts with our initial engagement with the public in order to ensure a successful rollout later, that they're brought along and incorporated with us all along the way. So yeah, we're going to start to have that conversation on Monday, and I suspect it's going to be a theme ongoing for the remainder of the process.
Okay. So Abby and I can work with Jane to try to propose an agenda for our next meeting based on today's conversation. We'll try to circulate that earlier in the week next week, so you all can kind of weigh in if you have any thoughts on how we should revise it. And maybe not at this next meeting, but certainly soon we could schedule some time to just kind of check in on these meetings generally and how we want to use them. I don't, the utility of kind of me droning on through a series of administrative topics may lose its luster pretty soon for everybody. So we can definitely try to think about how we use this time in the most effective way. And my hope is as the task groups get deeper into the work, there'll be more substantive stuff to share and reflect on when we get together going forward. All right, anything else before we go on to our friends from the public? Okay. So this is the first time I will have done this on Zoom. So anyone who, any members of the public who are interested in sharing some comments, if you could raise your hand through the hand raise function and turn your cameras on or audibly make yourself known, that would be great. So I see Jennifer Ramstetter. Anybody else? Got Graham. Okay. Anyone further? Okay, well, Jennifer, why don't you take a few minutes, and then Graham, you can follow.
Thank you all. I'm down in southern Vermont, and I'm really excited, and I thank you all for the work that you're doing. The reason that I'm so excited is because I taught at Marlborough College for 30 years, and interdisciplinarity was one of the things. Although I'm a scientist, I was continually working with students who had interests in social justice, in policy, in a wide variety of other things, and combining that with science. And I think that we have an incredible opportunity in Vermont with the Vermont Climate Council to really engage in some ideas that are interdisciplinary in nature and do the best we can for the people, for the land, for the climate in doing this. And I just wanted to give a couple examples of that. One thing in thinking about our forests, I think what we have to do in terms of, and I think what this subcommittee will in part do, is think about the practices that both minimize carbon output and sequester carbon and store carbon in the best ways. And then we have the opportunity to think about equity. What does that mean in terms of the various people who are involved? And that goes for our working lands, but I think we also have the opportunity to acknowledge some recent work that's done that shows that climate change and carbon sequestration and storage is enhanced in forests that aren't harvested. And what percentage of the forest should that be? Should that be 20% of our forest? Should it be 50%? I don't have the answer to that, but I think we have those opportunities. Likewise, within agriculture, I think we have opportunities to think, what is food justice? What is equity for the people, as well as what practices are going to sequester and store the most carbon. So I'm excited to hear some of the particulars that this group comes up with. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. And just so you understand, we're kind of neighbors. I'm about 20 minutes from Marlborough College. So hooray for Southern Vermont solidarity.
Exactly. I realized that when looking at your farm.
Okay. Let's see, Graham. Thanks, Jennifer. Graham, I believe you're up next.
Thanks, all. I'll try to keep my video on, but I do lose connection sometimes. Yeah, thanks for all of your time and work on this. I think it was a really interesting conversation today, and I just wanted to voice my appreciation, and I'm policy director at Rural Vermont as well, for David's comment earlier, which was sort of, I think he called it at the time, getting into the fifth dimension a little bit, and thinking a little more holistically, perhaps, and globally about the work we're doing here. And I think he's correct in that there's a real danger of quote unquote climate change solutions really having disastrous and negative consequences, both on the environment, but also on social and economic and political equity and sovereignty. And I think, having this process tied to some clear social, political, economic goals and outcomes could be really helpful for this group. And this gets, again, a little bit, and I think it was neat to see the definition of mitigation that the Climate Council is currently working with. That might be a definition to revisit, because I noticed it sort of includes what's being talked about as sequestration and adaptation in the same definition. And I'd refer you, a really interesting book I found dealing with agriculture on this was a book by Eric Tonesmeyer called The Carbon Farming Solution, which is a little old now, but he differentiates between mitigation, adaptation, and transformation. And I think that seaweed example that was just briefly brought up by David as well is a good example. We just heard on a National Family Farm Coalition and North Atlantic Marine Alliance call the other day, the real danger of a solution like that. We heard specifically from small scale fisher folks about the danger of industrial farming of seaweed that may happen specifically in order to feed fairly large scale ruminant operations. So again, when we're talking about things like precision agriculture and stuff like that, we might be talking about mitigation in terms of particular outcomes, but we're not talking about transformation into systems which don't need to be mitigated, but actually generate positive outcomes in and of themselves. And another just reference I would make to you all is this morning on Democracy Now! There was a really great conversation around climate change globally and a discussion about net zero carbon as a real greenwashing initiative by the corporate sector based on offsets, and the real need to increase the potential for that to really lead to increased inequity, land grabs, further consolidation and concentration in industry and resources, water, challenges for democratic control of places and resources. And it will not necessarily get us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or climate change outcomes if we really think in that offset type model. So, part of my question, I think, is still trying to understand what this carbon budget is going to be used for, and if it's going to be used for sort of an offset type model. And I really love that, Lauren, you went to that Just Transitions meeting, and I'd love to see a connection or hear if there's going to be a more consistent connection between this group and that group. And I think, globally and nationally and locally, farmers and working lands communities are considered frontline communities. And of course, frontline communities aren't a monolith. They're all quite differentiated from one another. But folks whose livelihoods are based on, working in these spaces are considered frontline communities. And it might be an important space for this group to have some agency And I think that's it. I'll leave it there. Thank you all again for your work and the intentionality you're really bringing to this.
Super. Thanks, Graham. Really helpful. Anyone else, members of the public, like to share some thoughts or comments right now? Okay, well, thank you all. Another great meeting and series of conversations. I think we're getting there, and Abby and I will get back to you with a proposed agenda, and please never hesitate to reach out to either of us with any questions. And looks like Jake put something in the chat we can all read. Agreed, and we'll see you all next week, if not sooner. All right, I'm gonna stop recording now. Thanks.